What if a crime could be executed so flawlessly that the perpetrator believes nothing can ever link him to the scene? That was the certainty in the mind of Daniel Reyes, a man who spent months mapping a secluded warehouse, cataloging every blind spot, and timing his movements to the second. He chose a night when the streetlights were dim, the only traffic coming from a single, abandoned delivery truck. He was confident there were no cameras, no witnesses, no audio recording devices that could betray him. In his plan, the only evidence that could surface was his own blood, the faint scent of gasoline, and the echo of his footsteps in the empty concrete. The investigation that followed the discovery of the body mirrored Daniel's own confidence. Police canvassed the area, interviewed neighbors, and combed through surveillance footage from nearby businesses. No footage captured the warehouse, and no witnesses came forward. The scene offered no fingerprints, no DNA, no trace of a weapon other than the blunt instrument left in the victim's hand. The detectives, satisfied with the lack of evidence, moved on to other leads. The case was closed as an unsolved homicide, and the suspect was never named. Yet, beneath the surface of that quiet night, a small, inconspicuous camera sat on a rusted metal pole outside the warehouse. It had been installed months earlier to monitor a construction site, its field of view angled slightly toward the building. The camera's image quality was poor, and its footage was considered irrelevant by both the police and the security company that owned it. No one thought it could play a role in a crime that, by all accounts, left no trace. When the case reopened years later, a routine re-examination of the area was prompted by a new forensic technique. The overlooked camera's footage was retrieved and reviewed. It showed Daniel entering the warehouse, his movements precise and deliberate. The clock on the video feed matched the timeline the suspect had claimed. The footage revealed a small metallic object he had dropped, a detail that contradicted his story of a clean exit. It also captured a brief, unexpected pause as a delivery truck passed by, a moment Daniel had never mentioned. The discovery of this footage shifted the investigation dramatically. Evidence that had once seemed impossible now lay on tape, exposing the flaw in Daniel's confidence. The case, once thought perfect, was unraveling. The footage could not be used to alter the past, but it could rewrite the narrative of how the crime was committed and why it was solved. The realization that a single overlooked camera had recorded everything, and that Daniel was unaware of it until it was too late, underscored the fragile line between a flawless plan and the reality of unintended surveillance. If you're following the thread that began with Daniel's seemingly flawless plan, you're already aware that the case is unfolding in ways that defy the initial narrative. Our channel is dedicated to dissecting those moments where a single overlooked detail turns a perfect crime into a solvable puzzle. In each episode, we trace the chain of errors, the missed evidence, and the investigative steps that reverse the outcome. Here you will find exhaustive breakdowns of cases that at first glance appear invincible. We focus on the mechanics of failure, how a small misstep, an unsecured door, a misplaced piece of clothing, a camera that was ignored, provides the foothold investigators need. By laying out the evidence in a clear, step-by-step manner, we show how the wrong assumption can be overturned. If you want to keep following these patterns, please subscribe so you don't miss new analyses. A simple like signals that you appreciate the depth of the investigation. When you comment, use a phrase such as, "I'm watching closely," or "This detail matters," to let us know you're tracking the case carefully. With that established, we can return to Daniel's story. In the next segment, we will begin the detailed breakdown, starting with the moment the killer believed he was completely safe. We will also examine the security system's design, the placement of cameras, and the timing of the perpetrator's movements. By mapping each action to the available surveillance data, we can see precisely where the plan broke down. By following the logic step by step, we reveal where the plan slipped and how investigators capitalized on those slip ups. Stay with us as we dissect each phase, uncovering the overlooked evidence that ultimately tipped the scales. The next episode will provide a granular timeline of each step, revealing the critical moment when the killer's confidence faltered. The man who would later be named by investigators as the suspect was a 37-year-old accountant named Daniel Reyes. He lived in a modest apartment on the second floor of a low-rise building in a suburban corridor that was quiet enough to be considered a safe place for a covert act. Daniel's daily rhythm was methodical. He woke at 5:30 a.m., brewed coffee, and spent the next 3 hours working from home, answering emails and reconciling accounts. At noon, he would take a 45-minute walk along the same stretch of road that led to the target's residence, always passing the same old oak tree that shaded a patch of grass. That evening, after a brief dinner and a solitary video call with his sister, he would return home, review the map of the neighborhood on his laptop, and mark the exact spot where he intended to act. He did this without a single pause or hesitation, as if the plan had been rehearsed in his mind for years. Daniel's confidence stemmed from a belief that the environment was void of surveillance. He had spent months observing the street's cameras, noting that the municipal system only covered the intersection of Maple and 3rd, a block away. He had also tested the blind spots of the security cameras installed by the target's neighbor, finding that the angles never captured the back alley where he planned to move. He assumed that the absence of cameras equated to an absence of witnesses, because the neighborhood's low crime rate meant that the few residents who did see him would likely dismiss his presence as a passerby. He also counted on the fact that the target's house was on a cul-de-sac, with a single driveway that was rarely used after midnight, making it a seemingly isolated location. His routine reinforced his certainty. Each night he would walk the same route, always turning left at the intersection, pausing for a moment to check that no one was following him. He would then cross the street, take the narrow path along the fence, and pause at the back door of the target's house, confirming that the lock was engaged and that the door was not open. He noted the time of the target's nightly routine. The lights would be on at 10:30 p.m., and the house would be quiet until 2 a.m. He calculated that he could finish his task in less than 10 minutes, leaving him plenty of time to disappear before the next wave of traffic. Daniel's mindset was utilitarian. He saw the crime as a puzzle to be solved, not a moral transgression. He had rehearsed the steps in his mind: the approach, the execution, the escape. He had even practiced the sound of the lock turning, the click of the key, and the faint thud of a body moving. He had mentally rehearsed the scenario where he would be caught, and he had built a mental buffer that assumed no one would notice until the cameras would record the footage, which he believed would be delayed by several hours. In his mind, the world was a series of predictable variables that he could manipulate. It was this certainty that lowered his guard. Daniel did not double-check the cameras, he did not consider the possibility of a hidden lens, and he did not take a moment to think about the potential for a passerby to notice him. He was confident that his meticulous planning would cover every eventuality. The assumption that the back alley was free of any recording device was the one that would ultimately prove to be dangerously wrong. The investigation began with a meticulous assessment of the alleyway that had been selected for the operation. At the time of the incident, the street was dimly lit by a single, flickering street lamp positioned at the far end of the block. The light cast a narrow, uneven beam across the cracked concrete, leaving the majority of the passage in shadow. The ambient temperature was cool, and the air carried the faint scent of exhaust from the nearby highway, further obscuring any potential auditory clues. The alley's layout contributed to its perceived safety. It was a narrow, two-lane passage bordered on one side by a row of brick warehouses, and on the other by a chain-link fence that had been partially removed by a recent storm. The fence offered a low, obtrusive barrier that made the space feel enclosed, and the brick walls absorbed sound, reducing the likelihood of external detection. The absence of any visible CCTV cameras or motion sensor lights was confirmed by a preliminary sweep of the area, which revealed no electronic devices or wiring that could have supported surveillance equipment. Time of day also played a crucial role. The crime was carried out during the early hours of the morning, between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock. At this hour, the city's traffic lights were in a low-intensity mode, and the streetlights were at their weakest. Pedestrian traffic was minimal, and the few vehicles that passed were often too far to notice a brief, deliberate activity in the alley. The darkness, combined with the limited visibility of the street lamp, created a visual environment in which a small, deliberate movement could be easily masked. Security measures, or the lack thereof, were a decisive factor. The alley was not a monitored zone. It did not fall under the jurisdiction of the local police patrol routes, and there were no private security patrols in the area. The building owners had not installed any motion detector lighting, and the chain-link fence was not equipped with any infrared sensors. When the investigators arrived on the scene, they noted the absence of any security signage or warning devices, which further reinforced the perception that the location was safe from detection. Investigators initially agreed that the scene showed no obvious signs of surveillance. A rapid survey of the alley revealed no hidden cameras or recording devices. The walls and fence were free of any suspicious protrusions, and the street lamp's wiring did not indicate any external connections. The lack of electronic interference, coupled with the physical layout that obscured the view from neighboring properties, led the team to conclude that the alley was a clean location for an illicit operation. Despite the thoroughness of the assessment, one detail was overlooked. At the far end of the alley, just beyond the flickering street lamp, lay a shallow, rusted metal box that had been partially buried in the concrete. The investigators, focused on the immediate surroundings, dismissed it as a discarded container of old insulation material. The box's presence, though inconspicuous, would later prove to be a critical element in the unfolding narrative. At 2:17 a.m., the alley was empty except for the faint glow of the flickering street lamp. The killer stood at the far end, a few steps from the rusted metal box that had been forgotten in the concrete. He had timed the approach to coincide with the last of the streetlights going out, ensuring no passing traffic or stray pedestrians would notice him. He lifted the metal box with a quick, practiced motion, his fingers brushing the rough, cold surface. The box was heavy, but he had rehearsed the lift, so his movements were smooth and deliberate. He set the box on the concrete, then knelt beside it. Using a small pry bar, he slid it into the narrow gap between the box and the wall, opening a narrow corridor that led directly to the victim's apartment. At 2 hours 18 minutes and 5 seconds, he slipped into the alley, keeping his back to the wall to avoid drawing attention. He moved at a pace that matched the rhythm of the quiet night, his steps measured and unhurried. He reached the door of the victim's apartment, pressed the lock with a key he had taken from a nearby trash can, and unlocked it. Inside, the apartment was dimly lit by a single lamp. He moved through the living room with the same calm precision he used in the alley. He crossed the threshold at 2 hours 18 minutes and 30 seconds, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. He walked straight to the bedroom where the victim had been sleeping. He paused for a moment, listening for any sound, then approached the bed. At 2 hours 18 minutes and 45 seconds, he lifted the victim's head with a single hand, keeping the body still. He held the victim's neck in a controlled grip, his fingers steady and firm. He positioned the victim's head so that the back of his neck was aligned with the edge of the bed. He then applied a sudden, decisive pressure to the carotid artery, a technique he had practiced for years. The victim's eyes fluttered once, then went wide open as the blood flow to the brain ceased. He did not hesitate. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, and his confidence in the technique left him unflinching. At 2 hours 18 minutes and 58 seconds, the victim's body collapsed onto the mattress. He stood for a brief moment, breathing in the stale air, then turned to check the clock on the wall. It read 2 hours 19 minutes and 12 seconds. He did not linger. He moved quickly, as if the timing of his actions mattered more than the act itself. He gathered the victim's phone, a small black device, and slid it into his jacket pocket. He also placed a single, dark, threadbare sweater over the victim's shoulders, a detail that would later be noted by investigators. At 2 hours 19 minutes and 25 seconds, he exited the bedroom and retraced his steps to the living room. He moved in the same measured way as before, ensuring he did not leave any footprints or disturb the floor. He reached the front door, unlocked it, and stepped back into the alley. At 2 hours and 20 minutes he paused, looking back over his shoulder. He saw no one. He turned around once more and walked away, leaving the apartment door closed and the victim's body undisturbed. He did not return to the metal box or the concrete. He left the alley, disappearing into the darkness beyond the street lamp. A minute later, a passerby noticed the rusted metal box and reported it to the police. The investigators later found a faint smear of black on the inside of the box, a trace that would later prove to be a critical element in the investigation. The first day the police responded to the alley, they followed the textbook protocol for an unattended body. Officers canvassed the immediate vicinity for witnesses, secured the scene with tape, and set up a perimeter. The victim's body lay in a shallow pit beneath the metal box, eyes closed, limbs slack. The forensic team collected a small sample of the black smear on the inside of the box, noting its consistency and possible origin. The box itself was catalogued and photographed from multiple angles, then transported to the crime lab for analysis. Meanwhile, detectives on the case began to sketch a preliminary narrative. The alley was a known spot for transient activity, but it rarely saw serious crime. The lack of a struggle, the absence of forced entry, and the body's position suggested a quiet, possibly opportunistic act. The investigators ruled out a homicide with a weapon, as no blood spatter or gunshot residue had been found. The black smear was assumed to be a residue from the victim's clothing or a small, accidental spill, nothing that would draw the attention of a seasoned detective. When the surveillance team reviewed the footage from the nearby streetlight cameras, they were met with a maze of low-resolution images. The camera that would later prove critical was one of the newer units, installed only a month before the incident, and its feed had been archived automatically for 30 days. The routine check of the 30-day archive, conducted by the CCTV analyst, was a quick scan for any obvious anomalies. A person moving unusually fast, a suspicious vehicle, or a crime. The analyst, pressed for time, flagged only a handful of frames that showed a silhouette near the alley. The silhouette was quickly dismissed as a passerby or a delivery driver, and the analyst moved on, logging the footage as unremarkable. The investigative team also relied heavily on the body's forensic profile. The victim's DNA matched a database of known offenders, but no match was found. The absence of a weapon or a distinctive mark on the body led the lead detective to conclude that the case was likely a random assault. The box, being a discarded container, was deemed a mundane element of the scene, not a potential source of evidence. The black smear, in the absence of any other trace, was recorded as a possible contaminant. Routine checks, such as the nightly review of CCTV footage and the daily log of evidence, failed to raise suspicion because the investigators were working under the assumption that the crime was straightforward. The standard operating procedure dictated that only footage with clear evidence of a suspect or a crime would be flagged. The camera that recorded the suspect's face was one of the newer units, and its footage was stored in a separate archive that was not automatically indexed in the daily review. Consequently, it remained buried under 1,000 frames of unrelated traffic. The investigators' focus on the physical evidence at the scene, coupled with a lack of initial leads, meant that the surveillance footage did not receive the scrutiny it deserved. The black smear, while noted, was not pursued as a potential indicator of a camera's presence, nor was the metal box examined for hidden devices. The detectives, confident in their early assessment, did not cross-reference the CCTV logs with the crime scene data, a step that would later prove crucial. Only when a second review, prompted by a fresh angle on the case, prompted the team to revisit the archived footage did the picture begin to change. The overlooked camera, once pulled from its silent archive, revealed a face that no one had seen before, and the evidence that had seemed mundane suddenly became the keystone of the investigation. The camera sat in a forgotten corner of the basement, wedged behind a stack of dusty filing cabinets and a sagging metal shelf that had been left to collect rainwater for decades. It was a tiny, weather-sealed unit that had been installed during the building's original construction as a simple hallway monitor, its purpose long forgotten after the old security system was upgraded. Its lens faced the narrow passage that led to the service elevator, a place no one thought would hold any clues. The camera's housing was painted a dull gray and had been covered in a layer of grime that made it blend into the concrete floor. To anyone passing by, it looked like a relic, a piece of outdated infrastructure rather than a potential witness. Because of its low profile, the camera was never mentioned in the initial crime scene notes. The investigators had focused on the obvious evidence: the blood spatter on the wall, the shattered glass on the floor, and the fingerprints on the victim's hand. The basement's dim lighting and the fact that the camera's lens was partially obscured by a broken piece of drywall made it seem unlikely that it could capture anything clear. The footage, if it existed at all, would have been low-resolution, grainy, and shot at 15 frames per second, a standard for older security systems that prioritize storage space over clarity. The storage medium was an old magnetic tape reel that had been stored in a sealed box in the back of the basement. The tape's label was faded, and the tape itself was brittle, making the risk of playback high. Even if the tape had survived, the team had no idea how to access it because the playback device had been retired and the cables had been cut. The camera's data had been archived in a small, forgotten server that no one had logged into for years. Because the camera's feed was never monitored in real time, no one believed it could have captured anything useful. The killer, meanwhile, moved through the building with the confidence that came from knowing the security system's blind spots. He never noticed the camera, as its lens was angled toward the hallway and not toward the victim's room. When the second review of the case prompted the team to revisit the archived footage, they discovered the tape had been mislabeled as routine maintenance. The team managed to restore the footage, and the grainy image flickered to life on a cracked monitor. For the first time, the camera's lens captured a fleeting shape moving through the hallway, an outline that had no resemblance to any known suspect. The face was obscured by a dark hoodie, but the movement was distinct, a quick step that matched the timeline of the crime. The realization that the camera had captured something was a shock. The investigators had never considered it a viable source of evidence. The team now faced a new mystery. Who was that figure, and why had they passed unnoticed by the killer? The camera's angle, a slight downward tilt, had captured the hallway from a height that made it difficult to see the full body of the victim, but it was enough to reveal the presence of an additional person. The resolution was low, but the motion was unmistakable. As the team prepared to dig deeper, one of the junior investigators, a woman named Maya, found the old server and, with trembling hands, connected the tape to the monitor. The footage flickered, and the image steadied. The screen displayed a figure that had never been seen before, an unfamiliar face, the camera's angle now revealing a glint of something metallic in their hand. The screen went black for a moment, then the image returned, clearer than before. Maya's eyes widened. She stared at the screen, the image frozen in time, and the rest of the team fell silent. The camera, once dismissed as irrelevant, had finally spoken. The next step was clear, but the question that hung in the air was whether the team could trust what they were seeing, and whether the figure on the tape was the killer or someone else entirely. The basement door creaked as if listening, and the mystery deepened, leaving everyone on edge, waiting for the next reveal. The screen flickered back to life as the investigators cued the tape. The room dimmed to focus on the grainy footage. Maya's fingers hovered over the play button, then she pressed it, and the video unfolded in slow, deliberate frames. The camera, positioned in the corner of the basement, captured a dimly lit corridor lined with old wooden planks. A single bulb flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. The first few seconds showed nothing more than the empty corridor, the silence punctuated only by the faint hum of the building's HVAC system. At the 0:12 mark, a figure appeared at the far end of the corridor, moving slowly toward the camera. The figure's profile was obscured by a dark hood, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. As the figure approached, a faint rustling sound could be heard, suggesting movement in the surrounding area. By 0:18, the figure stopped and turned, revealing a face that was the exact same as the one Maya had seen in the photographs of the suspect. The face was pale, eyes wide, and the expression was one of sudden shock. The camera's low resolution made it difficult to discern fine details, but the shape of the ears, the curve of the jaw, and the distinctive scar across the left cheek matched the suspect's known features. The next critical moment came at 0:25. The camera's angle, fixed to capture the entire corridor, revealed a second figure standing a few feet away, hidden behind a stack of crates. The second figure was the victim, their body slumped against a wall, eyes closed, and a small, clean cut on their neck. The victim's clothing was consistent with what the killer's story had claimed, a plain t-shirt and jeans. There was no sign of forced entry or struggle. The victim's face was still, and no blood spatter was visible on the floor, contradicting the killer's claim of a violent confrontation. At 0:32, the suspect's hand, still in the hood, reached out and touched the victim's shoulder. The movement was deliberate, not hurried, and the camera captured the subtle tremor in the hand. The suspect's fingers were stained with a dark liquid that, when the footage was later slowed, revealed a faint crimson hue. The timestamp overlay on the video confirmed that the recording was taken at 3:15 a.m., precisely when the suspect had claimed to be alone in the basement, supposedly searching for a lost item. The evidence contradicted that narrative. The suspect was present, the victim was there, and the suspect had physically interacted with the victim before the body was found. The investigators paused, each of them looking at the same frame: the suspect's face, the victim's body, the timestamp, and the lack of any other movement in the frame. The absence of a second person, the clear line of sight from the camera to the suspect, and the lack of any environmental disturbances made the footage irrefutable. If the suspect had been alone, the victim would not have been in the same place, nor would the suspect have been seen touching them. The evidence forced a new conclusion. The suspect had been present at the scene, had interacted with the victim, and had left the basement immediately afterward. As the footage shows the suspect's silhouette retreating into the darkness at 0:40 before the final cut. The team exchanged glances, the weight of the discovery settling over them. The footage was clear, unaltered, and recorded at the exact time the suspect had claimed to be alone. The physical evidence in the video, scarred face, timestamp, lack of other individuals, and the suspect's interaction with the victim, presented a narrative that could not be disputed. The investigators understood that this evidence would be the cornerstone of the case, and that the suspect's story could no longer stand against the unambiguous truth captured on tape. The killer, however, remained unaware that this video existed, oblivious to the fact that the truth was now in the hands of those who had finally listened to the camera's silent testimony. The morning of the second interview, the suspect was escorted back to the precinct in a plainclothes squad car. Officers kept his hands in the back of the seat, the radio crackling softly as they drove past the parking lot where the first interrogation had taken place. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, head tilted slightly to the side, and his fingers wrapped around the steering wheel of the van, a habit he had adopted since his first arrest. When they pulled into the interrogation room, the lead detective slid a tablet across the table. The screen was already open, showing a still frame from the surveillance feed that had been captured at the crime scene. The suspect's face was unmistakable. A dark beard, a scar across his left cheek, the same angle he had used when he had left the house that night. He stared at the image for a full minute, his lips pressed together, the corner of his mouth twitching. When the detective finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "This is the footage we collected from the street camera," the detective said. "It shows you at the scene, moving towards the alley, and then..." The suspect's eyes darted to the screen and back to the detective, his jaw tightening. He cleared his throat and said, I didn't know that camera was recording." He tapped the table with a flat hand, as if trying to shake the weight of the words. The detective nodded and pulled up the full clip, the audio muted. The suspect's shoulders stiffened, and he began to pace slowly, his back against the wall. He stopped, turned to face the table and said, "I didn't do it. I was with someone else." He pointed a finger toward the camera, as if to indicate that the footage was misleading. The detective simply raised a hand, a silent cue to continue. The suspect's hands started to tremble. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then sat down abruptly, slamming the chair back with his heel. He looked at the tablet, then at the detective and said, "You can't prove anything. That's a trick." He spread his hands wide, palms up, a gesture that seemed to try to encompass the room, the evidence, the entire situation. The detective's eyes flicked to the recorder, the one that had been running since the suspect's first interrogation. When the clip played, the suspect's face lit up with a flicker of panic. He flinched, as if a physical shock had struck him. He stared at the screen, then at the detective and said, "I'm not the one who did that." His voice was higher than usual, the words slipping out faster. He gestured at the camera again, as if to say, "You're looking at the wrong thing." The detective leaned forward, his fingers resting on the table, and replied, "The footage shows the exact moment you left the house. It shows your footsteps, your gait. It shows you." The suspect's shoulders sagged. He pressed his palms together, knuckles white, and whispered, "I didn't do it." He shook his head, a rapid, almost frantic motion that made the detective pause. The room was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner and the occasional click of a pen on the table. When the video ended, the detective turned off the monitor and placed the tablet back on the table. The suspect stood abruptly, his legs shaking, and walked to the door. He paused, turned back, and said, "You can't arrest me. I have no alibi." He reached out, as if to touch the doorframe, then stopped. He looked down at his hands, then back at the detective and said, "You're going to have to prove something else." The detective watched him leave, his face neutral, his eyes following the suspect's retreat. The suspect's confidence, once a steady rhythm, had fractured into a series of hesitant, contradictory statements. He had tried to deflect, to create doubt, but the evidence was a clear, unbroken line that could not be altered. As he walked away, the detective turned back to the recorder and pressed the play button once more, knowing that there was no way to reverse the facts now that they had been captured on tape. The recording, now in the investigator's possession, became the pivot around which the entire interrogation strategy rotated. The first step was to transcribe the footage with meticulous detail, noting every pause, shift in tone, and nonverbal cue. The transcript was cross-referenced against the suspect's earlier statements and the police report, allowing the detectives to identify specific moments where the suspect's narrative diverged from the documented facts. When the suspect was brought back to the interrogation room, the investigators presented the video in a controlled environment. A single monitor displayed the footage, while the suspect sat across from a recorder and a legal counsel. The detectives began by asking the suspect to recount his version of events in his own words, then immediately played the relevant segment of the video. Each time the suspect recited a detail that conflicted with what was shown, such as the time he claimed to have left the scene or the description of the vehicle he was in, he was prompted to explain the discrepancy. The video's clarity forced the suspect to confront inconsistencies. For instance, the suspect had claimed he was alone when he entered the victim's apartment, but the footage showed a second person walking in behind him. When asked about this individual, the suspect's answer was evasive and vague, and the investigators pointed out that the second person's face was visible in the footage, a detail that the suspect had never mentioned. This pattern repeated across multiple scenes. The suspect's account of the victim's state before the assault did not match the victim's visible injuries in the video. The suspect's explanation of how he exited the property contradicted the time-stamped exit shown on the footage. Each time the suspect's statements failed to align with the video, the investigators recorded the mismatch on the interrogation log. The log served a dual purpose. They documented the suspect's admissions of inconsistency and reinforced the chain of evidence that linked the suspect to the crime. The detectives also used the video to challenge the suspect's timeline. By playing back the exact moment the suspect claimed to have left the apartment, they demonstrated that the suspect had been observed remaining inside for several minutes thereafter. The suspect's subsequent explanations, claiming a sudden change of mind or a distraction, were systematically cross-checked against the video timestamps, and none held up. The analytical approach was strictly factual. The investigators refrained from emotional appeals or rhetorical flourishes, focusing instead on the objective evidence. They asked the suspect to clarify ambiguous points, such as the nature of the confrontation, and immediately provided the video segment that depicted the actual exchange. The suspect's reactions were recorded: a brief hesitation, a forced smile, and a sudden change in his vocal pitch. These subtle cues were noted by the investigators, reinforcing the pattern of deception. As the interrogation progressed, the suspect's confidence eroded. Each confrontation with the video reduced the plausibility of his fabricated narrative. The detectives noted that the suspect began to offer increasingly implausible explanations, often involving fabricated alibis or claiming external interference. However, none of these new claims found any support in the video or in the corroborating witness statements. When the final segment of the footage was played, the suspect's demeanor was noticeably subdued. The video ended with a clear visual of the suspect's exit from the crime scene, leaving no doubt about his presence. The investigators concluded the interrogation by summarizing the evidence. The suspect's statements were riddled with contradictions. The video provided an unbroken, objective record that contradicted every false claim, and the forensic analysis matched the suspect's DNA and fingerprints with the evidence found at the scene. The case, after the exhaustive cross-examination, was effectively closed. All relevant evidence had been documented, all inconsistencies had been addressed, and the suspect's narrative had been dismantled. The detectives filed the final report, noting that the video evidence had been the decisive factor in confirming the suspect's culpability. With the case resolved, the investigators turned their attention to the next priority, confident that the truth had been established through methodical, evidence-based interrogation. The final court filing listed the defendant on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. After the prosecution presented the body cam footage, the defense offered a brief argument that the evidence was circumstantial, but the judge rejected the claim, noting that the video provided a clear, continuous record of the suspect's movements and the moment of the fatal act. The jury delivered a guilty verdict within a single afternoon, and the sentencing hearing followed immediately. The judge imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and the deliberate steps taken to conceal the act. The investigation closed with a formal report that highlighted the single oversight that led to the case's resolution: a security camera positioned in the alleyway, which the perpetrator failed to notice or disable. The camera's footage captured the suspect's approach, the moment of the assault, and the escape route, providing irrefutable evidence that contradicted the suspect's alibi. No element of luck, emotion, or moral judgment influenced the outcome. The crime failed because the killer overlooked a basic precaution. The investigators documented the camera's exact location, the timestamp, and the frame-by-frame analysis that linked the suspect's face to the footage. This detail, though minor in the grand scheme of the operation, proved decisive. The case now rests in the archives of the district attorney's office, with the final report filed and the defendant's sentence recorded. The detectives, having confirmed that the suspect's narrative had been dismantled, turned their attention to their next priority. The closure of this case reinforces the principle that even the most meticulously planned crimes can be undone by a single, overlooked detail. For viewers who appreciate the practical insights into how perfect crimes can be unmasked, consider subscribing to the channel. Subscriptions support the continued production of in-depth investigations that demonstrate how small mistakes expose criminal intent. Liking this video is a simple way to acknowledge the work that goes into gathering evidence, reviewing footage, and piecing together the facts. If you watched until the end, please leave a comment with "I watched till the end" or "the detail gave him away" to let us know your engagement. When you're ready, head over to the next video, where we examine another case that failed because of a single oversight. The series continues to explore how investigators uncover hidden errors that bring justice to the surface.